Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Retail Council of Canada's 6th webinar in the Enabling Retail series. My name is Patrick Rogerson, Manager of Member Programs with RCC, and we appreciate you joining us today. Just very quickly, a few housekeeping items before we get going. Please take advantage of WebEx question and answer or chat feature to submit your questions. We actually have questions already coming in right now. People are very eager to get them in. We will be addressing those questions at the end of the webinar, though, so please stick around to that point in time. We do have a number to get through, so we will address all questions. If for some reason we're not able to get to your question, we will email you back directly. But if you do have a need to reach out to us, please reach out using my contact information at the bottom of the slide. Our agenda for today, we're going to be talking about types of epileptic seizures and some of the misconceptions behind seizures themselves, managing personal safety in emergency situations, and this will be from the customer and employee side. And then we'll look at job performance and accommodations, much like last year in our 2015 series, but this will have a little bit more of a feel towards epilepsy and planning for employees that have needs to remove barriers or find accommodations from that standpoint. And then finally, we'll get to our audience questions. Today, I'm joined by Jesse Preston, job developer and facilitator with Epilepsy Toronto. Jesse, welcome.
Thank you, Patrick. It's great to be here.
So probably the best way to start this is we need to have everybody understand what actually a job developer and facilitator is. So can you walk us through that?
Absolutely. So my role as a job developer is to connect our members with opportunities, and these are job seekers that are ready, willing, and able to do jobs in their field, and we connect them with employment opportunities. The facilitator portion is it's a tool that we use to train employers on epilepsy in the workplace.
Okay. So I know we've got a combination of slides we're going to look at today with content. We also have, for everyone that's on the phone, 3 videos, so please bear with us. There may be a little bit of lag as we get into those. Are you ready to go?
Absolutely. Let's go for it.
Okay. So first, what is epilepsy?
So epilepsy is defined as a neurological condition characterized by 2 or more unprovoked seizures, and they can manifest in sensations, awareness, behaviors, and some people are more familiar with convulsive seizures.
So when I looked at the definition, I found it interesting. I understand the aspect of unprovoked as opposed to induced on an individual, but why is it more than one? Why can't it just be one seizure where this potentially starts to define itself? Does a pattern have to occur?
Yes. So a million things could happen to cause one seizure, but epilepsy is defined as one seizure plus either the chance for it to continue or have more seizures, or a pattern of 2 or more seizures.
Okay. So causation.
So the majority of causes for epilepsy are unknown, but some of the more common include brain injuries, trauma at birth, brain tumors, strokes. Genetics has also been chalked up to it as well, because we've had a number of clients where it runs in a family. But generally speaking, most times the cause is unknown.
And I think from the list that I'm seeing here, and for some of the health and safety people that will join us on this call as well too, we often have seen it from the aspect of a workplace injury or some extracurricular activity, or hopefully, unfortunately, it doesn't result from a car accident. Very often that can be one of the initial causes, which is rather scary in many cases. But again, there's no necessarily major area where this takes place. It's really across the board. There's no percentage where one of them is higher than the others, correct?
No, and I didn't mention this earlier, but the prevalency of epilepsy in the population is about 1 in 100. So that's so 1% of all your customers, 1% of all your employees have epilepsy, which is quite the number compared with the rest of the population. So coexisting conditions. So one of the things that's often overlooked when it comes to epilepsy is that it rarely stands alone. There is often one or more of these that stand beside the disability, anxiety and depression, and that can spread out of stigmatism and isolation, ADHD and learning disabilities, cerebral palsy, autism. Brain injury is again, possibly from a car accident, stroke, so forth. Working memory is an interesting one. Working memory is defined as the ability to hold information in your short-term memory long enough to complete a task at work. I don't have the exact statistics, but I would venture to say 90 to upwards of 99% of all people with epilepsy have some kind of memory impairment, generally in the short-term area. Quite a few of them have a working memory problem.
Now, we preface this intentionally because we want to know what the causation is, the correlating conditions that show up with this. But as I started to do my research, I found that there was a number of different terms or types of seizures. And in our discussions, you educated me that it's really limited to 3 main components more than anything else.
Well, there's more than 3. There's a total of 40 different seizure types, but there's generally a core 6. Okay. But I'm only going to talk about 4 because these are the 4 that are most generally shown up. And in terms of classification, the terms are less important as the behaviors are behind them.
True.
And the reason is that they're trying to put it in a box. And epilepsy is one of these conditions that's very difficult to put in a box. So they keep changing the names to describe the behaviors as much as possible.
Okay.
So, and just to give you a rundown, focal seizures is a new term that is now replacing simple and complex partial. Tonic-clonic is, everyone is probably familiar with it in terms of being called a grand mal, and absent seizures used to be called petit mal.
Okay.
And they've changed those names to reflect, basically to describe the seizures a little bit better. Now,
everyone on the phone is probably, I'm hoping at some point, has somewhat of a sense of what this potentially could look like. They may have an individual in the family, maybe a colleague, friend, but everyone also has some misconceptions surrounding this as well, too. So can you walk us through what some of the misconceptions are?
So one of the things that I would talk about is incorrect first aid. This happens quite a bit. So there is still the misconception that you need to use a spoon to prevent someone from swallowing the tongue. It's not possible to swallow the tongue. A person may bite their tongue and might have problems with excess saliva, but they can't actually swallow their tongue. An additional issue that we've come across is that epilepsy first aid is not included in general first aid. They cover convulsions, and that's about it. Now, not all seizures are convulsive. In fact, many of them, the most common is called complex partial or focal seizure, and that's the most common seizure type there is. Epilepsy is an episodic and an invisible disability, meaning it doesn't occur all the time, it occurs sporadically, and you can't tell a person has epilepsy until they're having a seizure. Liability is often a comment that I hear, and generally it's from the point of view that, oh no, we can't have this person around because they may cause something, or they may break something, or they may hurt themselves. The issue that I find with liability is you can't assess liability until you've assessed risk, and you can't assess risk without having any idea what the person's seizure patterns may be.
Which means it's got to be an inclusive discussion to find out what the potential impact could be, which in some cases, actually I should rephrase that, not in some cases, but requires some voluntary disclosure that a person can have epilepsy.
Absolutely, and it has to be very individualized to each person, because I wouldn't say I've even come across two people that have the exact same seizure profile.
Yeah. They're
all different. And they all change when you're talking about length, duration, frequency, severity, type of seizure, what could trigger a seizure. All these things are different for each person. And, of course, when you need to call 911 is also varies between each person as well.
And I know we're going to dig in further when we get to the accommodation plans later on. Help us with the stigma and the isolation component for a person that can have seizures.
So And again, this does sort of spring out of liability because there are so many misconceptions, and there is a point of view that liability, that there's a perception of liability. People don't wish to disclose because they feel that other people will be threatened by them. Oh no, you can't come here. You know, we perhaps you sit down. You know, is there anything? You know, it's this kind of reaction, and maybe they haven't had a seizure in 10 years. You know, it's that kind of reaction. And as a result, people with seizures don't necessarily come out, come talk. You know, they have a tendency to isolate themselves. And it's also a fear of themselves of having a seizure in an environment. So not only are other people scared, but they're also scared, which creates the isolation factor. When to call 911? It is not necessary in most cases to call 911, and that is because the seizure will end on its own. And to illustrate that point, if someone wakes up and they go out for a walk in the community and they have a seizure, someone calls 911, they go to the hospital, the doctor will take a look over them. Oh, you're not having a seizure, thank you for coming, have a great day. Goes out to maybe the local restaurant, has a seizure, goes back to the hospital, is then looked over again. Well, there's nothing we can do for you. You think so? They walk out. Maybe they have a third one. They've racked up over $100 in ambulance bills, and no service has been significant service has been rendered by healthcare professionals.
That said, we have to temper that statement because we also have to look at, and we're going to get to this a little bit later, if there is an episode that occurs, have they sustained some type of secondary or a primary injury as a result of a fall, they've hit themselves off of something, we're taking that into consideration when we're doing our first aid triage at that time.
Oh, yes, absolutely.
Yeah. Okay. What about driving?
Driving is a big misconception that people with epilepsy cannot drive. In fact, it's 6 months minimum driving suspension. You can get your license back after 6 months. So there is that bit of a misconception that can't drive. Now, we obviously don't recommend that they get a job where driving is exclusively the main criteria for the job. But they can get a role where driving is a component.
Okay. So that said, I think it's important to remind our listeners that when it comes to a safety-sensitive position, operating a lift truck, working on a ladder, these are things to be conscious of. And it may be possible for a person who has had seizures in the past to reintegrate fully into a role that allows them to do those things over a period of time, though, of the absence of seizures.
Absolutely.
Okay. Okay.
Absolutely.
And then the last one, this is interesting. When we were setting this up, we started to talk about the heritage videos that were produced on CBC back in the day with Dr. Penfield and the catalyst that might actually, I shouldn't say catalyst, but the thing that might actually be a heads up that a seizure is coming.
Yeah, so we call that, earlier I talked about focal seizures. That is called a simple partial. Some people refer to it as an aura. And it is a sensation or a motor sign that a person is about to have a seizure. Now, when they started researching it and hooking them up to EEGs and doing diagnosis, they found out that this, in fact, was a seizure. And I can get into a little bit more into that later.
Sure. Now, is that going to be the case for everyone, that there always is a heads up, this is potentially coming, or is this only for maybe a certain percentage of those that can have seizures?
So I would say yes and no. So okay. Yes, it happens to a lot of people with seizures. No, in the sense that sometimes it can be only a split second, okay. Not enough time to react. Sometimes it's 30 seconds to 2 minutes, and occasionally, sometimes it doesn't happen.
Okay. Okay. So, folks, bear with us. We've got a video for our audience. We're just going to switch over. So Jesse, all three of those, they're complex partial seizures, correct?
Correct. So complex partial or focal seizures is defined by someone having a seizure in one portion of the brain. And depending on the area of the brain that's affected, you can see all kinds of manifestations of how it presents itself. So you can see someone who's, we saw the person wandering through the street. We saw one person who was sitting there and he was lip smacking his lips. We had another person who was grabbing their clothes and wandering around in a retail establishment. And one of the interesting things is when people look at this, one of the things that they comment is, oh, they look drunk. And yes, to a degree, it can look like that. But the problem is that this kind of seizure is often misidentified as something else. It is the most common kind of seizure, and in many cases, it is preceded by an aura.
Now, when it comes to first aid in a situation like that, how are we to proceed? And let's preface this: we're the retailer, it's a customer, or it's an employee that is having the seizure.
Yes. So in terms of, we'll say it's in a retail setting.
Okay.
So say there's an environment where maybe there's some glass vases in a store. Obviously, glass can break, and you want to move them away from these objects. So an important thing to do is not restrain, do not grab, because if you grab someone, they may jerk back. Right?
Essentially try to create a safe environment around them at that time.
Yeah, yeah. Okay. So one of the things that I would recommend is maybe just placing a hand on their arm and one on their back and gently guide them away. They'll be compliant so long as it's not forceful, because they are by definition unconscious at this time. So if you just guide them away from, say, the glass, it should work quite well. I would check their arm to see if they're wearing a medical alert bracelet, and in some cases it might not be a bracelet, it might be a watch, it might be a tattoo. So we've seen some of that as well.
Actually, one that I'll add to that, in my experience from a health and safety perspective on the first aid, also check the ankles. I have seen individuals wear that there, so this is a good thing for individuals to remember. It may not be on the wrist. It's possible as well that it could be a pendant. So a quick check is worth it as well, too. It depends on the environment that they're in, and realizing that some of the members we have on the phone also have manufacturing and some warehouse facilities. If there is any equipment that could be an entanglement, just do a quick check of the ankles as well, too, folks.
You know, I haven't heard of it being on the ankle before, but I'm not surprised. Yeah. I'm not surprised. I'm not surprised at all.
Now we've got two more videos, so yes, let's switch over once more. And the first one we're going to look at is an absence seizure, and then the second one, tonic-clonic. So, Jesse, it's interesting. I take a look at both those videos, and the first one, I love the fact that the young man doesn't necessarily realize that she's having a seizure initially, but after he's kind of given some instruction from her friend, he doesn't even skip a beat. He just introduces her right back into the conversation, which honestly is one of the best things to do to kind of get away from that stigma and that ostracizing or isolation of the person.
Exactly. I thought that was absolutely a brilliant part when they went to go make that video, that they really included that. So tonic-clonic, I know it talked a little bit about the first aid in the actual video, but some of the main points are put something soft under the head, roll them onto their side when the seizure begins to dissipate. Again, look for medical alert bracelet. Time the seizure, and we use this as a rule of thumb. That is, most seizures do not last longer than 5 minutes. So that's why we have seizure timing for about 5 minutes. Stay with the person, check them for injuries, never put something in their mouth, do not restrain them, and when they begin to come out of the seizure, reassure them, ask questions, you know, are you okay, how are you, do you know where you are, and questions along that line.
So going along that aspect as well, we're looking at the customer side here, and we'll go to employees in a moment. Recently I went to a DIY retailer, and I'll say I was fortunate enough to be in the aisle when another customer actually had a seizure. It was a father and son. The father had the seizure. The support team from this retailer actually went right into high gear. They performed just miraculously. It was great. We had a person calling, bringing in paramedics from the front location right to where the seizure was taking place. But the individual actually started to foam at the mouth, and while I was on the phone with emergency services, we described this to them, and their recommendation, which I agree with, was to roll them onto the side at that time in this specific case. And part of that was to drain the fluid from their mouth that was starting to build up at that point in time. Yes,
so it's not, you can't die from a seizure, you can't die from swallowing your tongue, but you can drown on excess saliva that is generated during a seizure. So by turning them on their side, you're allowing these excess fluids to drain from their mouth, essentially. And so that was great that yeah, you got ahead and had someone who could instruct you to turn them on their side at that point. It's not necessary to wait specifically to the end of the seizure. In fact, some people who have a simple partial sometimes put themselves into the recovery position prior to the seizure beginning, if they have enough time.
And that said, I want to temper that statement for everyone listening in, because the first question that was asked by emergency services, did they fall? Did they receive a neck injury of any nature? So we want to be very careful before we were going to try to roll them at any point. And it took multiple people to do that as well. It was a bigger gentleman. So now, what about on the employee safety side? And this is very unique, because remember, with retail, we're looking at potentially 24-hour operations, individuals that may be working alone, in isolation in the back of a warehouse. So what are some good tips we could use here?
So the first thing I recommend is training for all staff that will be working with this individual. We've got a wonderful program. It's called Epilepsy at Work, which I will highlight a little bit later on. And an important thing is to reduce hazards within the workplace, meaning, you know, don't keep stuff lying around that they could fall on, keep things neat and organized. I sometimes recommend a buddy system, not allowing someone to work by themselves, especially if they're not known to be stable. Ladder safety, forklift safety, of course. Consistent shifts. Now, this is an interesting part, is that there are times of day when people can have seizures. A lot of them are more towards the morning or at night. So having a very consistent shift is important. Retractable box cutters. When I worked in retail, there was a knife that actually had a spring load on it. So the blade would retract if you're not using it. So this would be an interesting safety feature for sure. Floor mats, rounded furniture. So basically to soften the impact of any falls or blows that could occur. So when it comes to job performance and accommodation plans, again, training is preferable, but in terms of the individual, allowing them time to take their medication. It's the #1 treatment for epilepsy is medication, and it's very important that they maintain a strict schedule on taking their medications. Again, the consistent shifts, so stay away from morning shifts right after working late shifts. An isolated place to recover, I can't, it doesn't seem to be the, if someone's having a seizure, they don't want to be viewed as lying on the floor, but a place that they can go in and rest it off is ideal.
And even good practices, depending on the size of the facility, it could be first aid room. It just maybe the back of the facility where you have a manager's office, or it could be the storage area as well too, depending on how much room you have at that point. But to avoid any potential extra embarrassment, and we want to be very sensitive to the fact that a person has just had a seizure, to be able to guide them into an area where they can recover on their own with the first aider that's present. Absolutely.
Absolutely. Processes to guard against theft during a seizure. So if someone is on, say, a cash register and they have a seizure, maybe have, if you can have multiple people on the cash, it's great, but just have someone, just close the till. Okay, they're having a seizure, close the till, and then tend to the individual. Not close down the till, but maybe just the open cash drawer. Buddy system, depending on how frequent their seizures are. And all of this has to be very individualized, I have to add, because, this might not be necessary for most people, but it may be necessary for some. Accommodations while learning. So again, earlier I talked about working memory. So sometimes we've used a job coach in the past to help get the information from their short-term memory into the long-term memory. Memory accommodations. This is one of the key accommodations that I talk to employers about, is giving written as well as verbal instructions. So if you give someone a list of 10 items, they may forget half of them throughout the day. And then they may come up to you and ask, well, what was it that you asked me to do exactly? So if they have a written guide to it or a checklist, they can just go through that. Now, with absent seizures, sometimes if someone has an absent seizure, they may miss a few words. It's good for them to, good practice to get them to repeat back to you in their own words what you want them to do as well.
So this is more of just a quick check-in type thing?
It's a quick check-in thing.
Okay. Okay. And maybe one more before we get into services, because this is really where I think for the retailers, they're going to draw the most benefit. I think about that buddy system for a minute, and I'm not picturing a large retailer. I'm picturing an independent retailer where they may not have anyone else around. It's one individual owns the location. They're the only one there all the time. Person down alarms I've seen used, the pendants that can actually be worn around an individual's neck. And there are even some systems out there now which I'm not necessarily going to recommend one to the audience that we have, but that can be hooked up to your smartphone, where if the phone actually goes lateral, it's based on the gyrosphere, and it will actually send out a signal to a security company to have emergency responders come if necessary. And this really depends on the nature of the business, but it's still additional ideas and tools that can be used. But we brought Epilepsy Toronto in for a reason. That's because very often when it comes to job coaching, for an individual that's going into a retail location, there may be that need for support from an outside agency. So help our audience with that. What can Epilepsy Toronto do in the way of services?
So in terms of services to retailers, I'll tell you a little bit about my role. So part of my job is to help create customized accommodation plans for individuals based on their seizure and disability profiles. So that is one thing that we offer. Another thing that we have is diversity recruitment. So if you're one of the organizations that has a requirement for hiring a certain number of people with disabilities, or if you're in one of the top 100 employers category, we can help by providing pools of pre-screened applicants.
And maybe we should ask this now, just we don't want anyone leaving off the phone without knowing this. Who pays for the job coach?
So the job coach ultimately, it's dependent if there's any social programs out there, so we help troubleshoot the cost of it.
Okay.
We have not, as of yet, charged an employer for any services related to job coaching. It's not happened yet. We have our own program. Sometimes I myself may go in and do some coaching as well.
But neither the individual that's having the seizures nor the retailer is bearing the cost of that today. It's typically subsidized.
For the most part.
Good. For
the most part, it's subsidized. Some of it is actually through funding that we have through various government programs such as ODSP. In addition to that, we've done work site assessments. So we never just put someone into an environment without knowing what the environment looks like, what hazards may be there. We call this an at-risk assessment. It's different from OC Health, which has a full risk assessment, as where this is what are some of the potential areas that could be of a health and safety risk.
Kind of a gap analysis.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Now, what I wanted to talk, what I mentioned earlier was the Epilepsy at Work training, and this is an online resource. It's going to be available in November in both English and French, and shortly it's going to have accessible versions in described video as well as closed captioning. And it is a free AODA training for epilepsy in the workplace. It has a printable certificate, and it's good across Canada because AODA is one of the top standards for disability law in Canada. And it's available for learning management systems. We're actually giving it away as much as we can to companies. It's SCORM compatible.
Okay. It
covers epilepsy first aid. It has a full resource library, including things like helpful accommodations for customers, incident reports, you name it, we've put it in there. If something is not in there and it's felt that it would be useful to the general population, we'll put it in there.
And we can give people kind of a look. So this is the splash page for the website, correct?
Yes.
Okay.
So it's not your average course. This is a course from the perspective of Nancy, who has just been diagnosed as having epilepsy, and it's about her journey to keep her job. And in that, you learn about epilepsy through her eyes.
Well, and I even remember last year we worked with Tim Nurse from Epilepsy Toronto. I remember him walking me through the seizure decision tree, the video where you actually had to train your staff on how to respond to a customer seizure. They did ask the spoon question. Again, I don't know how many people fell into that trap, but it was actually quite a good scenario for people to go through to determine how do you respond effectively. So it gives multiple decisions. It's not just a quick yes or no or two paths. You really have multiple choices to make. So it's a great website. I encourage everyone who's attending today actually to check it out when you have a moment. One other piece that you recommended.
So in terms of, and this goes back to customer accommodations, because someone might not be aware of what their seizures look like. So we've got something in here called a seizure incident report. And someone can actually, the more information that's gathered on seizures is better for the individual, because you have to remember they're unconscious. And being unconscious, someone asks them, well, what do your seizures look like? Well, I don't know, I'm unconscious. You know, so it's a great tool for helping them educate them on what their seizures look like, and it's very important for their physician to have this information because it could help customers and employees that have epilepsy with diagnosis and treatment of their epilepsy in the future.
We probably want to preface that the individual that's filling this out needs to be very clear if they don't have an answer, not to provide additional information, just what is unknown and it's very clear to them.
What they've observed.
Yes. Okay. I'll preface it this way. Probably our last slide is a good parting piece, so let's switch gears for our audience.
Absolutely. So this is actually my record being a job developer. These are all positions that I have had clients that have actually obtained these roles. So every single one of those titles has been held by a person with epilepsy that has come through our agency. And I've divided it both into the store support and contact center side, as well as the retail operations and warehousing side. So as you can see, you have people with epilepsy can provide a wide range of jobs, not just your customer service, but things like human resources manager, project manager, everything down to the person sweeping the floor.
Now, we did this at the last minute. I know you're probably going to go back to the office today and have a couple phone calls for you, so I'm sorry. For those in attendance, we have put Jesse's information up. Please feel free to dial or send a direct email to info@epilepsytoronto.org, and Jesse or the team will be able to respond to you. Please give them a little bit of time, depending on the amount of calls and emails that do come in. But I know you're sticking around for the question and answer, and I think it's important to let our attendees also note you're going to be joining us for webinar number 7 as well, when we get into support persons and animals, and it'll probably allow us to dive a little further into what the job support actually looks like, the mechanics of it, correct?
Yes, absolutely. I'm looking forward to it, actually.
Perfect. So, Jesse, thank you. I really appreciate it. Folks, we'll take a brief pause for a minute and allow some of the questions to come in, and then Jesse will address them one at a time.
Okay, so we have lots of questions. Unfortunately, we won't be able to get through all of them today, but we've got made note of them all. So we will try to get to everybody's questions over the next few days. So the first question I'm going to pose to Jesse is, when you are trying to move a person away from danger, can they hear you?
So a person who's having a complex partial seizure is unconscious, and that's why they've changed the term from complex partial to focal seizures. And I'm not going to say that it's impossible for them to hear you, they just cannot react to you because they're unconscious. So to answer your question, guiding them verbally probably will not help, and that's why it's you have to guide them away. So I can't quite confirm if they can hear you or not.
Okay, so the next question is coming through. Have you had an incident where an employee either was not aware or did not disclose and there was an episode that happened at work? If yes, how was it handled and what learnings came from it?
So sometimes this happens on occasion, and it's one of the reasons that we go in and we do assessments, because sometimes a human resources professional doesn't know what to do when a person has had a seizure for the first time at their workplace, and that's where we've come in and we've done individualized accommodation plans. We identify what can be some of the risk factors. So an example, we had a person who was in a deli-type position, and it was a hot deli, so they'd be working over things like fryers and stuff like that. So one of the things that we had done was move them away from, say, fryers, but had them do work along the lines of prep, because it just so happened that their seizure profile heat was a trigger for seizures. So we moved them away from things like the fryer and put them on activities that didn't have heat involved in them. And the person's still working there. So they've managed to keep going and held their job quite well.
That's great.
Okay, so the next question is, was there a time when a customer had a seizure at a retail location? How was it handled, and what was learned from the event?
Oh, so this is a real good. Actually, I can give you a whole slew on stories, but I'll give you the shortened version of this. So we've had incidents where a customer is in a store and they have a simple partial seizure. They have a warning, an aura, and they've attempted to go on to the cashier at the front of the store to let them know that they are going to have a seizure and what to do about it. By the time they've gotten to the front of the store, they've gone into a full, complex, partial seizure, and they've wandered out of the store with product. In some cases, police were either called or got involved. Loss prevention obviously had stepped in, and at this point, accounts vary. So depending on the story, I've heard stories where they've woken up in police cars in the back room of loss prevention. Loss prevention standing there and trying to talk to them about why they're stealing and explaining to them that they're under arrest and they're confused and don't understand what's going on. So this is one of the reasons that we've done a lot of seizure first aid training with groups such as the Toronto Police. And it's one of the reasons we encourage people with loss prevention, especially, to get this certification so that when they see someone having a seizure, they know how to respond.
Yep.
You don't just walk them, you don't just grab them. You don't, they're not running away, they're dazed or they're wandering. They're not aware of their actions because they're unconscious. So and that's the kind of story that we hear tragically far too often at Epilepsy Toronto.
And I think it's important to temper that. It's not as though you're getting off the hook and you can just walk away at that time. This is actually an opportunity for the exceptional customer service you want to see a retailer provide. This person's having a seizure and it's a loss prevention manager, or it could be a cashier. They are there now to almost protect them to a certain degree and make sure that the person having the seizure doesn't go into harm's way. And that's probably the thing that's going to make this individual a lifer when it comes to going back to that retailer.
Absolutely. So we had, and I'll give you a positive story. So we had a gentleman who did have a seizure and had wandered out of a small retailer with some product, but the retailer had already known that this person had seizures and had complex partial and knew how to respond. And it wasn't a big deal. They stopped the individual, they waited for them to come out of it, and they processed the transaction, the person went on their way. And that's the kind of retailer that we love to talk about, because it's someone who knew what to do, knew that this wasn't someone who wasn't being mischievous or attempting to steal, and that it was beyond their control. So,
great.
Okay. Have you found employees with disabilities to be open about their disability, and to that organization to provide accommodation? Are they open about it?
So again, that's very individualized. So some people are very open about it. Other people are not. And I wish I had the statistics in front of me, but there was an actual study on which seizure type was most likely to disclose. Epilepsy is near the bottom, with mental health as well.
Really?
Yeah. So they're not likely to disclose because it's heavily stigmatized. So the more stigma is associated with it, the more unlikely it is that they are going to disclose. So are they open about it? In some cases, yes. If there's a program where there's an advantage to disclosing, we find that some individuals are more likely to disclose, and they get accommodations for it. And they have a tendency to stay in those organizations a lot longer because there's less stigma, there's more acceptance, and there's more people with disabilities in those organizations.
Okay, so one final question. Where should we start?
It's a loaded question.
It is, but it's important, though. Like, it's,
Yeah, so where should you start? So I would start by having, in terms of response, a seizure response plan, And that's where epilepsy at work really can come into play. You know, you have someone who has a seizure for the first time, you know, they're an employee, they have epilepsy, you know, they've disclosed to you. What do you do? What circumstances should we call 911? What do your seizures look like so that we know what to do? Let's frame this in the way that it's as safe as possible. In terms of customers, you know, seizure first aid training for some of the staff, I would encourage, especially after telling loss prevention story, that it be loss prevention personnel. So again, I would start by creating a first aid policies.
Hold on a second. We got a question coming in real quickly. Patrick?
Yep. So we have one more question. Can a seizure be triggered because of the environment that the person's within? And I think we got to know a little bit about this before with the accommodations on the individual working near heat. But are there other examples, Jesse?
Yeah. So there's so in some cases there are triggers for seizures, and so heat was the example that I used earlier. Lack of sleep is another one, which is why we talked about things like shift work. There's a lot of people who, you may see these signs up occasionally in places that have flashing or strobe lights, where there's a warning on the side of the wall saying that this facility has flashing or strobe lights. If you have epilepsy, it's not recommended that you come here. And so again, flashing lights, sometimes weird smells. Heat is a big one. So there are a number of triggers that could be an environment that could create, that could trigger a seizure.
But I think when you get into a conversation with an individual who is voluntarily disclosing that they have seizures, that can be a two-way conversation with the employer at that time to try to figure out what those mechanisms might be.
Yeah, and in some cases, you know, those fluorescent lights that flicker when they get close to dying,
yep.
those are pretty big for causing seizures because they have a strobe-type effect.
Yep.
Now, photosensitivity is actually quite rare. It's 1 in 1,000 people with epilepsy. So in terms of triggers, it's not necessarily the biggest one, but absolutely an environment can have a impact on a person.
Well, Jesse, thank you for coming in. I'll tell you right now, you've probably tackled more questions than any other presenter we've had thus far. On your own, that is. We've had 2 people, but you've taken on a lot. So thank you very much from the Retail Council of Canada and the individuals that are attending this webinar today. For those on the call, folks, we thank you very much for attending. We will be sending out an email on Monday next week with a recording for the webinar and to set up our next webinar, which will focus on support persons and support animals. Have a great day.